class. This is not going to be an in-depth Bible study. If it were, this would be a semester-long, one half for the Hebrew Bible, and then the other half probably for the New Testament. And nobody signed up for that tonight. So this is going to be like a 30,000-foot view. This is to help us get our bearings on what is the overarching story that the Bible is telling. And I remember some of y'all may think about, like, sometimes when I preach or something, I might be preaching on a story that you have not heard since you were in children's Sunday school, right? Because really the last time that we do this kind of formation, this looking at everything from the big picture, we're down in the children's building. And then once we leave those stairs, we don't go back to it again. We might do studies on particular books of the Bible, particular topics of the Bible, but we don't really think about the whole picture and how everything fits in place. And so that's really the intention of this class. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the Hebrew Bible, which we would ordinarily call the Old Testament. So the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K-H, Tanakh. And that is an acronym. It stands for the 3 different parts of the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, which is your first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch also. The Nevi'im, which is just Hebrew for the prophets. And the Ketuvim, which is Hebrew for the writings. So that makes up our 3 major sections of the Hebrew Bible. But not all of them are created equal. The Torah is the most important, the most authoritative. And so everything else kind of supplements and points back to the Torah. And I'm going to be referencing pretty much 2 books tonight. This was my Old Testament survey book from undergrad. It's very thin. This is my Introduction to the Hebrew Bible from seminary. Very thick. But both give great overviews, and if either of these can be a resource to you, please let me know. They're both wonderful in their own right, but I spent a lot of time this week and last week flipping through these books in ways that I haven't done since I was 19 for this one. But the Intro to the Hebrew Bible has a great division that pretty much we're going to be following tonight and next week. So part 1 is the Torah or the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible. Part 2 is the Deuteronomistic history. Say with me, Deuteronomistic. Deuteronomistic, right? I'm going to be saying that a lot tonight, okay? And this means that the theology from Deuteronomy put on to history is the lens, okay? And so that's going to be kind of this middle part of our Bible. This is Joshua and Judges, Samuel, originally 1 book, not 2, Kings, originally 1 book, not 2. So these kind of historical more books. Part 3 is prophecy, which would be the former prophets, the latter prophets in the book of the 12. We'll get into that next week. And then finally the writings, which would be all of our other things. So Ezra and Nehemiah, Chronicles, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Job, our Hebrew short stories, which are Ruth, Jonah, Esther, and then post-canonical Tobit and Judith, Daniel, Maccabees, all those fall into that writings category. So I want to talk about some major themes of the Hebrew Bible. What is trying to be communicated here? The law is trying to be communicated here. Both the initial reception of the law and also the practice of the law. The Exodus, the deliverance, the most central piece of the entire Hebrew Bible. Who is king is another major question that's going to be asked over and over again. These ideas of justice and righteousness, which preoccupy not just the prophetic works, but also some of the wisdom writings we have, exile, and then return from exile. So these are our major themes. A lot of people really, really love dates, but I'm going to just give you 2 to remember for this whole time, for these 2 weeks. 2 important dates. The first is 722. 722 is the fall of Samaria. That's the fall of the northern kingdom, right? This is going to be a very important date, particularly as we're heading towards the prophets. The second one is 586, the fall of Jerusalem. That's the southern kingdom. And yes, that's important because it's the fall of Jerusalem, but this is also an important marker when it comes to the writing and recording of the Hebrew Bible. Most of what we have written is written after that fall while the people are in exile. Now, why would they need to write it when they're in exile? Because all of a sudden they're scattered, right? And this is an opportunity for them to write down the important moments of their faith. The final shape of the Hebrew Bible took place in the post-exilic Second Temple period. So this would be after they've returned. Ezra and Nehemiah have built walls and temples. And then the Torah, those first 5 books, are a product of the 6th century BCE or later. So again, that 500 situation, right? A lot of reforms are going on there. Now, there's also something else that I want to introduce y'all to, the JEDP theory. JEDP, also called the documentary hypothesis. Now, the whole point of this is, how does the Hebrew Bible come together with all these different voices? And there's a very prominent hypothesis that most people assent to, including me, so I'll name my bias there, that there are 4 major sources for the Hebrew Bible. And they came together under Deuteronomistic editors to pull it all into one stream. And this mostly applies to Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible. And each of those letters stands for a different source. You have the Yahwist, that's the J, and we know that source because God is referred to as Yahweh or Adonai. It's also a more colorful rendition. Think about the talking snake in Genesis and describing God in more human terms, of God walking and talking with people. Typically, that's from the Yahwist perspective. Then the E is the Elohist. God is referred to as Elohim in this. And often, revelation is associated with dreams. So less of God walking and talking with people, and more of God revealing things in dreams to people, right? Think Joseph, right? The P stands for the priestly. This is the orderly account. This primarily happens in Genesis 1, Leviticus, and all those genealogies that everybody skips over during their devotional time. The priests are very interested in not only order, but also proper worship. That makes sense, right? So these kind of pieces in our Bible that are very structured are going to be that priestly source. And the last, the D, is the Deuteronomist. Deuteronomist is very, very concerned with reform. They hail Josiah as the reformer. It's about centralized worship, and the centralized theme is covenant, right? So those are just some important things of here's the structure of the Hebrew Bible. Here's perhaps how some of the sources come into play. And what I like to think about this is from our Christian perspective, we have our 4 Gospels, right? These are telling the same story from 4 different perspectives. And there's overlap, certainly, but there's also places where they're diverse. There's things that only occur in one gospel. I like to think of that the same way that we think of the JEDP theory as well, right? Like we have these multiple perspectives that are trying to come in and have a unified stream somehow. Now, one of the indicators of this are things that are called doublets. These are things that happen a couple of times, and you're like, why is this repeated? The theory behind it is because there's 2 different authors who are writing about the same thing, and they're trying to converge together. Probably the most famous is the 2 creation accounts. Genesis 1:1, 2 through 3. This is, and God said there would be light, and there was light. And then God said, let there be sea creatures, and there were sea creatures. Very ordered. The end of that is, and God created humankind in their likeness. Male and female, they created them. Okay? And then we have the whole story of Adam and Eve right after that, when we've just heard that God's created all of humanity and says, be fruitful and multiply. You can't do that with one person. There's been at least 2 people created. And then Genesis 2 through 3 is where we get the story of Eve being created from Adam's rib, that sort of thing, as well as like the temptation with the snake. Another example of that you may or may not remember is that Abraham liked to tell people that his wife was his sister. Does anybody remember this story in the Bible? It happens 2 different times to 2 different kings in Genesis 12 and Genesis 20. Now the question is, did Abraham just not learn his lesson? Or is this the same story told from two different perspectives? Is this two different editors coming together? And then, to top it all off, his son Isaac also does the same thing with Rebekah later in Genesis 26. Anyways, we are going to now get into the meat of things, which are going to be our major stories. And we're going to try to get through Judges today. All right? We're going to try our best to get through Judges today. And we're going to start with the Pentateuch. Again, those are those first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And there are kind of 4 major parts of the Pentateuch. I know it doesn't make sense. We have 5 books and 4 major themes, but just stick with me for a second. The first is what's called the primeval history, and that's Genesis chapters 1 through 11. The second is the patriarchs. The third is deliverance. And the fourth is the law. So we're going to dig into this a little bit. The first is the primeval history, which is, has anybody ever heard that phrase before? It's fun to say. It's fun to say. But this is the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And there's several important stories that, again, we probably remember from children's building time, and we probably haven't heard since. Or we've heard it plenty of times, but we haven't done a Bible study on it since. Let's say that. The first is our creation stories, and I say stories because there's 2. I don't want to get into it too much. That's a fun Bible study for another day. But again, you have God creating humanity, God creating man and woman, and that leads immediately into the second story of the primeval history, which is the fall in Genesis 3, 1 through 24, where we have the temptation of Adam and Eve. Immediately following that is the story of Cain and Abel. It is the first murder recorded in our Bible. Next, we have the genealogy from Adam to Noah. That's everybody's favorite story in Genesis, right? Just the genealogy of Adam to Noah. And then we have this interesting story about the sons of God called the Nephilim, who are intermarrying with the women of earth. So think angels intermarrying with heaven. I don't plan on preaching any sermons on that anytime soon. But this is important because it's a story that leads into why did the flood happen? God had created this great, wonderful, ordered world, and then things have gotten really disordered and terrible. And so then we have the flood. And in the flood, we have an important thing. We have the rainbow, not just because they're pretty, but because this is a visible sign of God's covenant. This is a visible sign of God's covenant, the rainbow. And we'll see that several other times throughout the Bible. As you might have learned in your world history class, there are other flood narratives within the ancient Near East. The Bible was not written in a vacuum. Gilgamesh is probably the most famous of those. The next story in the primeval history is the Tower of Babel, which the question there is, how does the languages form? How do people spread across the earth? So what's the point of this primeval history, these first 11 chapters of the Bible? I think what it's doing is it's answering the question for the people of Israel, why is the world the way it is now? Why are people spread across the earth? Why do we speak different languages? Why don't angels live among us if they're God's creation too? What do we do when someone does something really, really terrible and we can't find reconciliation, as with Cain and Abel? And then what do we do with sin, and where did it come from? So what these first 11 chapters are doing is creating an understanding and a worldview. My Hebrew Bible professor in seminary used to say the Bible is mimetic, which comes from the same root as mime. It shows us, it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what we want to say. It paints these beautiful, wonderful pictures, and we have to figure out exactly what they mean. And I think that Genesis 1 through 11, that primeval history, is a perfect example of that. We ready to move on to part 2 of the Torah? We are, whether or not you're ready for it. And this is the patriarchs. This is Genesis 12 through 50. So this gets us through the rest of Genesis. So this goes from general understanding of why the world is the way it is to God's choice to be with a specific people. And this is done through the patriarchs. The first one is Abram. We call him Abraham. He had many sons. I'm one of them, and so are you. His name doesn't get changed till much, much later, which we'll get to. And he has a wife named Sarai, and they are from Ur, and they get up and they go out as they're commanded by God. And so God gives Abraham a special covenant. We have the covenant with Noah, which is called a universal covenant. Nothing could ever break it. It applies to all people. But in Abraham, we have a specific covenant, a blessing of land, descendants, and divine protection. And it's repeated at least 4 times within the book of Genesis, within a matter of chapters, over and over again. And then it's repeated again to his descendants over and over again. The sign of this is not a rainbow. The sign is circumcision. And at this moment, too, in chapter 17, this is when Abraham's name changes, right? So Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Now, Abraham was given the promise of many descendants, and yet he had no children. We might remember this part of the story. And so Sarah thinks it's a really good idea to say, well, why don't you have a child with my maidservant Hagar? And they do, and they have Ishmael. And I think too often we overlook Hagar in the story. She is extremely important. She is the first person to name God. When she is desperate and in need and tells God, I just want to curl up and die, she calls God El Roi, which means the one who sees me. And so this complicates the story for Abraham and Sarah because God blesses Hagar and Ishmael and says that I will make you a mighty nation as well. But we do know that eventually Sarah has Isaac, whose name means to laugh. She thought it was hilarious that she would have a baby. And so the least amount of time is spent on Isaac as opposed to all of the other patriarchs. He gets 2 chapters in the whole Bible. And some of that is dealing with his 2 sons. So he gets very, very little time on his own. Perhaps one of the most famous stories we remember from him is from chapter 22 of Genesis. Whenever Abraham hears God say, bring your son up to the mountain and sacrifice him, and God provides the ram in the bush. In my mind, that has a lot of parallels to the Hagar-Ishmael story of God saving people from the brink of disaster and bringing them back to God's self. In this section, we also have the story of Lot and Lot's wife, who turns to a pillar of salt. You remember this one? This is also the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. And Ezekiel 16, so I'm going to skip ahead to a prophet. Ezekiel 16:49 tells us what the sin of Sodom was. The sin of Sodom was a lack of hospitality because they did not aid the poor and the needy when they had excess. And so Lot and Lot's, and I'm going to get back to this when we get to Judges because there's a parallel account in Judges as well, so hold tight on that. So we have Abraham, patriarch, passes on to his son Isaac. As I mentioned, the least amount of time is spent on him. He, like his father, also says that his wife is his sister in response to a king. Strange family trait, I suppose. But what is really interesting is in Genesis 26, 3-5, that same promise given to Abraham, that same covenant, is verbally given to Isaac as well. Isaac isn't known as a particularly spiritual or holy man in any sort of way. We don't hear a lot about his devotion at all, but yet he carries on this promise. Isaac marries Rebekah in chapter 24 of Genesis, and they have 2 sons, twin sons, who fight even in the womb. And then by chapter 27, again, I said it wasn't very long, Jacob managed to steal both the birthright and the blessing from his big brother Esau and flees off to another land. As little time is spent on Isaac, there is ample time spent on Jacob, who is renamed to Israel. Jacob, after fleeing to another land, goes to this guy named Laban, who's the cousin of his mother, and he marries two women, not on purpose, Leah and Rachel. So he works for 7 years, intending to marry Rachel, and gets tricked and has to marry Leah, the sister, and works for 7 more years and marries Rachel. Between not just the two of them, but also their maidservants, there are 12 sons. This is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel from. But I thought it would be interesting to talk about the order in which all of these are born, because sometimes we just think of the 12 of them. So the first are by Leah: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And then Rachel gets very mad and says, well, why don't you try to have children with my maidservant Bilhah? So then there's Dan and Naphtali. At this point, Leah's not able to have any more children. And so then she says, well, I want you to have children by my maidservant, Zilpah. And they have Gad and Asher. And then there's like this situation with mandrakes, which are supposed to be aphrodisiacs. And like Leah gets them from somebody else's son. Anyways, and then so she has 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and the only girl, Dinah. Do you know that Jacob had a daughter, one daughter? And then finally, Rachel has Joseph, the prize of her eyes, and then many years later has Benjamin, and she unfortunately dies in childbirth with him. After all of this happens, except for Benjamin's birth, Jacob decides that it's time to go home again. So he flees Laban, wrestles with God, and makes amends with his brother in a matter of 2 chapters. And then something really interesting happens. There's a passage of scripture in Genesis 34, sometimes called the rape of Dinah, sometimes called the defiling of Dinah. It seems like Dinah was in love with this man, and he asked for her hand in marriage, and then her brothers got really mad and killed them all. And so that is an explanation behind the strife between these 2 family units, which would then become great nations. I believe it's the Ammonites, but I could be wrong. You can go back to Genesis 34 and check me if you'd like. It's at this point that Jacob is renamed to Israel, which is like a really important thing that happens within the Hebrew Bible. If somebody gets a new name, pay attention. And pay attention to what that name means. So after Jacob, you have Joseph. And the story of Joseph, from a genre standpoint, is a novella. It's a mini novel. It can be all condensed into just a few chapters, and it could be self-contained. It could really be its own book. And we know Joseph from his coat of many colors and his dreams, and perhaps his lack of humility around his brothers for both of those things. Afterwards, his brothers betray him, and he is sent off to Egypt and sold into slavery there. But again, we have another interesting story. Y'all, Genesis is like a soap opera. So just hold tight with me for an interesting story and the importance of it for just a moment. So in Genesis chapter 38, Judah, the 4th son, has a son and marries him off to a woman named Tamar. Well, he dies, and they're not able to have any children. So then custom indicated that Tamar should be married to his next son. And she does, and he dies, and they have no children. Well, then there's a 3rd son, and he's come of age, but Judah will not let her marry him. So Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute at the city gates. Judah goes to said prostitute at the city gates and impregnates her. Now, he finds out in a few months that Tamar is pregnant and says, well, we have to do what we have to do with her. We have to kill her, right? Well, you see, what happened was Judah left a couple things behind with the woman at the gate. He left his staff and his signet ring, which could only be associated with him. And so he realized that he was the father. It's a real Maury Povich situation there. So why is this story important? Do y'all remember where we hear the name Tamar in the New Testament? She is one of Jesus's ancestors. She is listed in the genealogy of Matthew. And so from this really terrible story comes our Savior. And we'll talk about some of the other women who show up in his genealogy as well. So back to Joseph. So he has his adventures in Egypt, which involves running away from Potiphar's wife, having his reputation dragged through the mud, and then becoming imprisoned. While imprisoned, he has many dreams, which are then interpreted back to the Pharaoh. He ends up working in the royal court. And then he receives his family back in the famine. And why this is important is it helps explain how the people of Israel ended up in Egypt, right? They ended up in Egypt because there was a severe famine and they needed help. And Egypt was the one with the power and the grain. It just so happened that Joseph was the one to open those gates for them. Also, in this last passage is a blessing of the sons from Jacob on. And what's really interesting about that is typically in this time, the firstborn son gets the biggest blessing, right? Well, in this case, Judah, as in Judah and Tamar, gets the biggest blessing. Judah would eventually become where Jerusalem sits, the southern kingdom, become the most prominent of all the 12 brothers. It's not Joseph, it's Judah. Now, and we will have this in other parts of the Hebrew Bible too. Think about it. David, the great king of Israel, was the youngest son. So it's an example of how God perhaps uses the people we least expect to draw us into relationship with God. And then finally in chapter 50, we have the deaths in Egypt. And Joseph reminds them of God's promise that they will leave this place, that they will go to a land that God has promised them. So what's the point of the patriarchs? How did Israel become God's chosen people? Working through this lineage. That is the point of this major section. All right, on to Exodus. Perhaps the most important story in the Hebrew Bible for people of the Jewish faith, the story of deliverance. And here's how it starts. The people flourished, and that there were two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And Shiphrah and Puah were told that they were supposed to kill all of the children who were birthed. But they said, the Israelite women are just too strong, and they're just gone before we can do anything, before we even deliver the babies. Here's an incredible point about Shiphrah and Puah. These are two midwives named, right? You want to know who's never named throughout Exodus? The Pharaoh. He is only Pharaoh. This is a literary, intentional point. That this man with all this power doesn't get a name. But these people of mine do. So it starts with Shiphrah and Puah. And then we have the story of Moses, the great prophet of the Jewish faith. He is found in the Nile, escaping. His sister Miriam finds him again. That's actually the lesson they're learning about in VBS tonight. And his own mother becomes his wet nurse. And then, again, thinking about people who maybe we shouldn't follow, but God chooses. Moses kills a man and then flees. He marries and has children. His father-in-law is Jethro, who becomes important. And all while this is happening, while Moses is in his own crisis, God hears the people cry out. And this is where it all turns. Then we have the call of Moses, where he hears God speak to him from the burning bush. And God says, I am who I am. Now, Moses' call as a prophet will parallel later prophets within the Hebrew Bible, where they're called, they say, I'm not worthy. God says, I'll give you some help. They say, I still can't do it. And God says, you're going to do it anyway. So this is a similar prophetic call that happens over and over again. And we'll see that pattern pick up. But it really starts with Moses here. And this is also where we're introduced to Aaron, his brother, who is said to help him. From this point, we get to deliverance. This is the let my people go portion of the story. And then some reason, there's a genealogy smack dab in the middle of it that doesn't seem to make much sense. But, again, if we're thinking about that JEDP theory, this is a place where that priestly editor, where his stuff goes. We have plagues, but before the plagues come, there are signs of God's power. The staff turns to a serpent, and each time the Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And the plagues are water to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock dies, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and death of the firstborn, which then initiates the Passover. At that moment, that's where we begin with the Exodus. That's chapters 12 through 15 of Exodus. It's the institution of the Passover, consecration of the firstborn, feast of the unleavened bread, and God guiding them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God has not abandoned them, and God delivers them through the Red Sea. We're going to get a little bit more into genre next week, but poetry is a major genre within the Hebrew Bible. And we have an extended poem called Moses' Song of Deliverance. And then we also have just one verse in Exodus 15:21. This is called Miriam's Song. And it's probably the oldest portion of the Bible that we have. And the reason why I say this is it's a song. How many of us know songs before we've memorized any prose or poetry or anything like that? Right? So before writing was probably a relevant thing when it comes to the Torah, people knew Miriam's song. It's just 2 verses. And so they go into the wilderness and the people immediately start grumbling. I mean, Miriam's song is in 15:21. In 15:22, the people complain. They're not even their feet aren't even out of the Red Sea yet. And they start to complain. And this is the stories where we have that there's bitter water that's made sweet. There's manna that comes across the ground. There's water from the rock. There's a battle in there. And then because the people are grumbling so much, Moses' father-in-law wisely says, you need some help. And so Jethro's advice comes of dividing the people into smaller groups with chiefs to handle all the problems. Right after that's the law at Sinai. This is chapters 19 through 24. This is where we get the 10 Commandments, which if you didn't know, that's in 2 places in the Bible. It's here and in Deuteronomy as well. There's other laws that you can read about yourself if you would like to. But perhaps another part is, remember back to Joseph. Joseph tells his brothers, don't worry, God's going to give us the promised land. The people are enslaved in Egypt. They're delivered. And God says again in Exodus 23, I haven't forgotten about you. You're going to inherit the promised land. There's 6 chapters of how do we worship, which includes instructions on the Ark of the Covenant, the table for the bread, the lampstand, the tabernacle, the oils, the altar, the priests. And then they get all this instruction. And Moses comes down off the mountain, and the people have melted down their earrings and their necklaces and have created a golden calf. So then we try again. And Moses goes back up on the mountain. He gets new tablets. The covenant's renewed. Moses gets a shiny face. His countenance is so shiny from being in the presence of God that he has to wear a veil. Then we get the construction of the worship materials, and the glory of the Lord now resides among them. So what's the point of the Exodus? That God is the deliverer. That Israel still is God's chosen people, no matter what happens to them by outside forces, or no matter them doing really, really silly things like making a golden calf or grumbling as soon as they get through the Red Sea. And that God is still fulfilling the promise to Abraham. That Abraham's covenant that God made with Abraham still applies to them. So that's the point of the Exodus. The next book is one of my favorite books in the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus. Not saying that sarcastically. I love it. And it's really divided into 2 parts. So if you think about Leviticus in 2 parts, it becomes a little bit more manageable. There's the priestly code, which is chapters 1 through 16. And this is about things that priests do, right? So it's about sacrifice. It's about worship. It's about the holidays. And then you have the holiness code, which is ritual purity. What prevents you from worship? I do want to take a moment just to designate here. There's a difference between sin and ritual impurity. If you've been at Northside long enough, you've heard my definition of sin, which is sin is what we do that breaks relationship with God ourselves, creation, or community. Ritual impurity is something different. And this isn't something we practice as Christians. But what would happen is sometimes there's things in your ordinary life that would prevent you from being able to go to worship without becoming pure again. Things like touching a dead body. Things like menstruation. Things like whatever you do on your date night with your spouse when you come home. All of those things would make you ritually impure. Those things were not sinful, but that's an important designation that's going on here in Leviticus 2 of what is sin versus what is ritual impurity. But there's a couple of really important pieces of Leviticus that sometimes if we just read it over, we miss the importance and the radical nature of it. The first is how to treat the stranger, right? So you have the Israelite people who have yet to come into Canaan, who have yet to have a place of their own, and yet they're being told by God, this is how you treat the stranger among you. So you have them already being taught preemptively, when you do have a home, when you do have a place, remember that you were once a stranger and treat them accordingly. The other thing is the Sabbath year and Jubilee. So every 7 years, all debts were forgiven, all enslaved people were made free, and every 50 years that would go on too. That was the year of Jubilee. So what's the point of Leviticus? What will set us apart from our neighbors? This includes these dramatic things like how to treat the stranger, the Sabbath year and Jubilee, but it also includes things like their dietary restrictions. We know that we are a chosen people of God from the patriarchs. We know that the promise of Abraham reigns true, and yet we aren't supposed to be like everybody else. And so the laws that we have set us apart from our neighbors. So after this comes more wandering in the wilderness. Numbers, what we call Numbers in the Hebrew Bible is literally called in the wilderness. So another fun fact, a little nerdy fact for you. All of the books of the Hebrew Bible, their names are just the first word of that book. Okay, so what we call Genesis, the first line of Genesis is Bereshit bara Elohim, okay? Genesis is called Bereshit in the Hebrew Bible. So the same thing is true. So Numbers starts in the wilderness, and so therefore the Hebrew name is in the wilderness. And it starts with a census with the people at the base of at Sinai. There's more priests, more laws, and more worship laws. But then we get some wilderness stories, and these are really interesting because they parallel what has already happened in Exodus 14 through 18. And so these form what's called, I love this, the murmuring tradition, i.e. people are complaining. So these are your stories of complaints. Sometimes we love how human the Bible can be. And so you might remember they were complaining about food and they were given manna. They complain about the manna now, and they are given quail. You remember Moses is overwhelmed. Jethro appoints chiefs. Well, now they're complaining about the elders, and so more elders are appointed. There's also a fight between siblings. Again, how real can you get? So Miriam, Aaron, and Moses are all fighting with each other. They give Miriam leprosy. She survives it, don't worry. And all of this wilderness is happening as they're trying to figure out, okay, are we really going to enter into the promised land? And so they send out the spies. Does anybody remember the story about the spies? This is Joshua and Caleb, right? And they go into the land, and all the spies say, the people are too big and they're too strong, we can't do it, except for Joshua and Caleb. What we forget is that right after that, the people rebel. They are not happy with this result. They do not want to go into this land. And God tells Moses, I'm just going to destroy them all and start over with you. Yes. I know I said I'd never flood the earth again, but there's some other options out there. So Moses talks to God, seems to calm God down, and then God says that, okay, well, only Caleb and Joshua will enter the Holy Land. And there'll be 40 years of wandering to come for everybody else. And then Israel's defeated in a battle. So not a really good section here. We then have more laws inserted into our narrative. And then we have another rebellion called Korah's rebellion. People are really not happy with the leadership that they're experiencing as they're wandering in the wilderness. And so the ground swallows them up. In order to settle this dispute of who was going to be in charge, God gave budding staffs to determine the 12 houses. And it says that that will stop the grumbling. So instead of the people disputing over who their leaders are, if somebody's staff budded, that meant you're the one. The next section I called Death, Destruction, and Moving Along. Because as we remember, the only two people who are going to enter the promised land are Joshua and Caleb. And so this is the situation. Unfortunately, Miriam passes away. And then Moses strikes a rock and gets water from it, just like in Exodus, except not so much. Because Moses is upset, and he strikes the rock and doesn't give God credit. And so now Moses and Aaron will not enter the promised land. Aaron dies, there's battles and land disputes, there's a snake that bites a bunch of people, because God sends a snake to bite the grumbling people. And then there's a bronze snake that people look at and it heals them. But again, this is the part where the people are narrowing down as they're entering into the promised land. There's also issues with intermarriage in this. There's a new census. And then I'm going to stop again for one of my favorite passages that we miss because it's at the end of Numbers. Okay? In Numbers 27, there's a story of the daughters of Zelophehad. There's 5 daughters and no sons. And before this, daughters couldn't inherit the land. And so the daughters of Zelophehad think that this is completely unjust. And so they bring it to the chiefs and they bring it to Moses. And Moses brings it to God. And God says the daughters are right. Give them their land. And so this, again, is another way that they're set apart from the people around them. Not only that, yes, the daughters can inherit land, but that God is willing to listen to them and what their needs are. So then, towards the end of Numbers, we do have Reuben and Gad settling down on this side of the Jordan in Gilead. And then we're moving on into the promised land. So what's the point of Numbers? What happens in the wilderness? And who moves on to the promised land? And how and why? That's what story we're getting at in Numbers. I'm going to spend a brief portion on Deuteronomy. We love the Deuteronomist. We're going to hear a lot about him in the future. And Deuteronomy literally means second law. It's presented as a farewell address of Moses or a series of 4 sermons. And it could be considered preached law. It's going to have a lot of the same thing that we've already heard in Exodus and Leviticus. But there's a couple really important points that I want to make known. The first is that it does talk about the death of Moses in chapter 34, which is not extensively talked about in Numbers. And it also has perhaps the most central verse to the Jewish faith, which is Deuteronomy 6:4, called the Shema. Shema means hear. And it starts like this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then a portion that we should be very familiar with as Christians. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And this also encapsulates Deuteronomistic theology, which is about the centralization of worship and monotheism. There is one God. This is the one God who we worship, and this God is particular to us. So I don't want us to skip over Deuteronomy as if it's just a repeat of all the other laws we've already thought about, because this is something that's very, very distinctive. So what's the point of Deuteronomy? It highlights the leadership of Moses. It's the basis for Deuteronomistic history as it influences Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And it is, I don't even know that we can say how important it is. It is so centrally and monumentally important for the centralization of theology for the Israelite people. This is where it comes from. Been talking at y'all for a long time. Promise. We're getting close to the end. I guess before I go to Joshua, any questions that have come up so far? And I'll use this to plug something else, which is week 5 of this is question and answer time. So as things come up, write your questions down and then submit them to me. So that way that by week 5, me or Jason will have time to prepare to give you an actual answer to said question. All right, so we are on to Joshua. And Joshua in Judges is all about how the people are coming into the land. How do the people possess the land of Canaan? Joshua is about taking the land. There's several summaries that talk about this extensive takeover, but then the actual narratives show a little bit more limited taking of the land, to the point that even at the end of Joshua it says, you need to still drive out the inhabitants here. So it's like, okay, Joshua, what is it? Are the people driven out? Are they not driven out? Historically, this land is a land that was contested over. The Egyptians and the Hittites had just finished a terrible war for control, and a weakened Egypt seemed to have prevailed. But there's sea peoples, not mermen, but they're from Greece, coming over on boats that are also coming at this time. So at this time, where there's just been a war in the area, Egypt is weakened, the people have just fled from Egypt, and you have sea peoples coming in from the coast. This is the same time period that Joshua and the Israelite people are coming in. Mind you, people that probably didn't remember the time in Egypt. So these are a lot of younger, newer people. There are lots of parallels to Joshua, to Exodus, especially in structure. And just think about it. Joshua was mentored by Moses. So of course there's going to be some parallels in their leadership especially. There's 2 main parts of Joshua. There's the narrative, which happens in chapters 1 through 12, which is the story of all the conquests. And then there's the apportionment of the land, which takes up 8 chapters of Joshua, of how the land will be divided among the tribes. So in the narrative of conquest, there's an opening speech by Joshua. It identifies him as leader. We already know from the end of Exodus that Moses has said, "This is my successor," and this is Joshua really taking on that mantle of leadership. In chapter 2, we get the spies in Jericho. Anybody remember that story from Sunday school? So spies get sent out again, this time to Jericho, and there's this nice woman, Rahab, who takes them in and hides them. And they say that, hey, if we destroy this city, you're going to be saved. Fast forward to chapter 6, all those things happen again. Do you want to know where else we hear Rahab's name? The genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 3. Another interesting part is, did you know that there's another parting of waters in the Hebrew Bible? We know the Red Sea, right? Red Sea was parted. Well, in Joshua, the Jordan River is parted in a very similar way. And the people cross over the Jordan River on dry land. The Ark of the Covenant parts it for them, and it's a sign that God will give them the land. Again, this is the same covenant being repeated time and time again through similar miracles that they could remember from generations past. Not saying, we believe that God is doing a new thing, but sometimes God works in patterns too. There are more conquests in chapters 7 through 12, which you can read if you would like, or skip ahead to chapter 12, which just has a list of the defeated kings. But what begins as long stories of conquests gets shorter and shorter and shorter, till at the end it might just be like 2 or 3 verses. The last piece is chapters 23 and 24, the farewell and the covenant. So what's the point of Joshua? How do the Israelites come to possess the land? And I'm going to add a second thing that I don't have in my notes here. How will we be led after Moses is another thing, right? I think about in business, there's something called, founder syndrome, that when the founder, moves on or passes away, how will that business survive? There's a question here of, can we survive post-Moses? And the answer with Joshua, with his mentee, is that yes, we can, and God still is with us. So Judges is about how the Israelites came to be in the land, but they struggled to take the land for more than a century. So you have Joshua saying, hey, we've taken all the land, and then Judges says, well, we believe God will give us this land in faith, but we still have some work to do. Now, along with Leviticus, Judges, so I'm going to say this a lot. Judges is one of my favorite books. I love Jonah. Jonah is one of my favorite books. Can't wait till we get to Jonah. But Judges is a really interesting book from a literary structure. So I remember when I was, when I would be, translating from the Hebrew to the English, I'd be so concerned about each and every letter, the verb tense, what it was trying to say, that sometimes I'd miss the big picture. And Judges is a big picture book, okay? Because there's this pattern, it's a cycle. On my PowerPoint slide, I had arrows. It was great. It's a four-point pattern that happens over and over again in the book of Judges. The people sin. God sends punishment. They cry out in repentance, and then God delivers them with a judge. Let me give you a few verses from Judges 3, 7 through 11. But the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot their Lord and God and served the Baals and Asherahs. So they sinned. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of the Cushan-Rishathaim king Aram-Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years, punishment. But they cried out to the Lord, repentance, and he raised them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz. Is that everybody's favorite judge? Right? Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. So this is the pattern. And this happens over and over and over again in Judges. However, it's just not two-dimensional, okay? So this perhaps is an irreverent analogy, but just follow me for a second. The literary structure of Judges is like a toilet bowl, okay? It goes around and around and around and gets worse and worse and worse. So that you still have this same pattern, but by the time you get to end of Judges, things are terrible. Much worse than they were at the start. But it's the same sort of fourfold pattern. Let me tell you more about that. Please don't leave here saying that Courtney says the Bible is a toilet bowl. There are 13 judges in the book of Judges. The first of which is everyone's favorite. Again, his name is Othniel in Judges 3. The next is Ehud, which is a fantastic story of the Bible, y'all. Fantastic story. In undergrad, my professor for Old Testament survey told us there was going to be a question about him on the final. Ehud is the left-handed Benjamite. And why is that important? Your left hand was not your clean hand. Your left hand was used for non-clean things. And so everyone was right-handed. And so Ehud assassinated King Eglon of Moab because he was left-handed. And the king wasn't expecting that. So he came through with his left hand and slit his bowels open on the floor. That's in the Bible. Yes. It's a toilet. We're back to the toilet. And this is only the second one, so we're not even at the bad part yet. Okay? We also have Shamgar, everybody's second favorite judge, who struck down 600 Philistines with the ox goad. But then we have Deborah, who we're more familiar with, right? We're more familiar with Deborah. She's the only female judge. She led alongside Barak, and she was also a prophet. Then we have Gideon, another famous judge, who led Israel to victory with only 300 men. This is also where we get the sign of the fleece from. You know, that phrase we sometimes use, you just lay out a fleece. But again, remember back to Moses and how he said, God, it's not me, I'm not ready, I'm going to need something. Gideon occupies that same sort of prophetic call in a lot of ways. He says, okay, if you lay out the fleece and it's wet around the outside but dry on the fleece, then I'll go follow you. Well, that happens. He says, well, God, I don't think that's enough. How about I lay out the fleece again, and if the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, then I'll believe you. And then he still took a little bit of convincing after that, I think. But what's also interesting about Gideon is that his son Abimelech tries to become king right afterwards. And a big struggle that we're going to find post-Judges is, remember that question we asked, who is king, at the very, very beginning? At this point, God is supposed to be king. By the time we get to Samuel, God says, the people have rejected me as their king, so do get them a king. This doesn't first start with Samuel, but Abimelech back in Judges tries to become king, and he's shut down real quickly. We then have Tola and Jair, again, people's favorite judges. And these people were judges for a pretty long time, and we just read over them, as I'm doing right now. And the Bible itself only gives Tola 2 verses, and Jair 2 verses. We then have Jephthah, who is perhaps one of the most tragic judges. He makes a vow. He says, God, whatever comes to my front door, I will sacrifice in honor to you, and so I can win this battle. And his daughter comes to the front door, and he sacrifices his daughter. So again, remember that, or maybe a twister, instead of a Bible metaphor, things are getting worse and worse and worse, to where even the judges, even the people who are most righteous among us at this time, are making poor decisions. We then have Ezban and Elon and Abdon, those guys, who each get 2 verses. And then finally Samson. We're more familiar with him. He gets 3 whole chapters. And he is known for his immense strength. He fought against the Philistines, but unfortunately his story ends in tragedy. And then we have this verse that kind of sums up where the people are in chapter 17. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. We have this series of these kind of 4 really terrible stories. You have the tribe of Dan, which pretty much is revolting. And then you have the story of the Levite's concubine in Leviticus 19. It's a different Levite than the one a few chapters ahead of time. Essentially, his concubine flees. He goes back to her home, has dinner with her family. They're going back home, and he stays in this town called Gibeah, which is in Israel. It's the province of Dan. And the men there say that they want to have sex with the man there. The man they are staying with offers his virgin daughter and the concubine. They take the concubine, sexually harass her terribly to the point that she is found dead at the threshold of the door. And then the Levite cuts her into 12 pieces and sends it to the 12 tribes of Israel to tell them to go to war. Again, if we're thinking about things are terrible, things are depraved, we're switching to violence, this is where we are at the end of Judges. And you might notice in this passage, it sounds very much like back to Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah, of the 2 angelic guests coming, of them being treated and thrown out, and the city facing judgment. So what happens then, unfortunately, is more violence. A civil war ensues among the people of Israel, and all of the tribes take up arms against Benjamin and almost wipe the entire tribe off the map because of what they did. So what's the point of Judges? The people continued to do evil, and it expressed the need for a unified leader. I think it also shows, left to our own devices, people will do terrible, terrible things. And we need a God to save us. We're not going to be able to do it on our own. And so my hope was for us to get through Judges today, because that puts us at a really good point, which is moving more into some of the prophetic literature. We at this point know from Judges, things are bad. Things are really bad. So what's going to happen next? And what's going to happen next over the next few books is God will rise up leaders. The first being Samuel, and then Saul, and then David, and their lives kind of get intertwined with each other. God does something because this is not how God's chosen people are supposed to be acting. And we are at 7:08. I said we'd get out at 7:30. However, we're going to have a lot to cover next week, so is it okay if I dip into a couple of other things? All right, so we're going to step away from, we're not going to go into Samuel right now. We got to tell Samuel, Saul, and David all together, because they're like a 3-corded braid. We just have to tell them all together. But what we can talk about is genre within the Hebrew Bible. So when we think about genre in English literature, what are some of the genres that might come to mind for us? Horror, okay. Romance, okay. Poetry. Fantasy, right? All these are fiction. We also have like nonfiction, right? And various forms of nonfiction, right? Like, a research paper is going to read a lot differently than a history book. So we have all of these things in our own literature. We have all of these things in Hebrew literature. We've just talked about a few horrific things, right? Anyways. So one of the genres that we find within the Hebrew Bible is history. This is where we're going to get 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're all going to fall into that history category. Now, within these larger, big, broad categories, there's going to be other things within it that are going to fit into these other genres as well. You've read parts of your Bible where one minute you're reading a story and then all of a sudden there's a poem in there, right? It's going to be mixed in there. There are also pieces of fiction in our Hebrew Bible, which is not heretical. There's comedy. Jonah is written as a comedy. It has jokes written into it. I've translated it from the Hebrew to the English. There are jokes in it. It is hilarious that in Exodus, the Pharaoh was never named. There is mud on his face. There's also the novella, like we talked about with the Joseph story, right? These self-contained things. And then we also have really, really beautiful examples of Jewish short stories. So again, Jonah would fit into the short story category. Ruth would fit into the short story category. Esther would fit into the short story category, which never mentions God, by the way, throughout the entire thing. Doesn't mean God's not present. God's present all the time. We don't always recognize him. So we have short story. We also have lots and lots of poetry. When you think about poetry within the Hebrew Bible, what's a book of the Bible that comes to mind? Psalms, right? We think of Psalms. When we think about English poetry, we think about things that rhyme, right? We might think about, Dr. Seuss, something like that. Think about rhyming in meter as part of the artistic expression of it. Think about, in the Hebrew Bible, parallelism is equivalent to rhyme and meter. So you'll have two lines that say almost the exact same thing, but in two different ways. Probably one of our most famous is one that's quoted in the New Testament, where Jesus is said to ride, I think it's in Matthew, upon a colt, and then the foal of a colt in the next line. And so you have this image from Matthew that Jesus is astride of two animals. But really, that is just parallelism. It's reinforcing that idea. It's a common part of Hebrew poetry. Read the Psalms and you're going to be able to see it everywhere now. You're going to be like, oh, that's why it says this almost identical line two different times. Another huge and important genre is wisdom literature. Wisdom literature will be Proverbs, but also what we would call Ecclesiastes, but in Hebrew is called Kohelet. Same thing, just two different names. Wisdom literature. And also apocalyptic literature. Especially the second half of Daniel is apocalyptic literature. Same genre where we have Revelation, right? This unveiling of things. So all of these genres, right, are within the Hebrew Bible. We have other genres within our New Testament. We think about Gospels, we think about epistles, that sort of thing. And for me, putting this literary criticism on it does not detract from the holiness of Scripture, the truthfulness of Scripture, the authority of Scripture. If anything, it, for me, enhances the artistry of God, that these are the different ways that God has instilled creativity into humanity. God is the ultimate creator. And so we can learn so much by analyzing the genre of the different portions of Scripture. But just like I got really, really into the tiny little letters that I was translating, sometimes we can get a little bit too concerned with these other categories of what genre is it, what date was it written, and we can miss the point there too. But it's all used to enhance it for us. What we'll be getting into next week, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about Daniel and, not Daniel, we will get to Daniel, but he'll be at the very end. Perhaps the latest book of the Hebrew Bible, by the way, probably written closer to the New Testament than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Also written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. So, portions. But we will get into the saga between Samuel, Saul, and David. We'll get into, and I'm going to be real honest with y'all. Does anybody ever get lost with like the kings and the succession of them? Me too. So we're not going to get into that very deep. So if you're looking forward to knowing a lot about Jeroboam, I can direct you some great resources. But we're going to talk about some of the kings. We're going to spend a good bit of time on the prophets, mostly because it's one thing that I love and get just jazzed about, particularly the 8th century prophets, exile and then return from exile. So we have a good bit to cover, but we have covered a lot today. And so I want to thank y'all for your time. Like I said, I will email that PowerPoint. I am sorry that it did not go out to y'all. And then my intention is at the end of the course to have like a graphic for y'all that kind of has these big chunks with the sub chunks underneath it. So that way, you know, when a kid comes up from the children's building and says, hey, we learned about Miriam today, you know who Miriam is and where she fits in the bigger story, right? Or when you're doing your devotional time and you read that genealogy of Jesus and you see Tamar and Rahab and Bathsheba, you know who these people are and why they're important to the bigger story. So that is going to be my time. We're going to get out a little early tonight. So thank y'all. Appreciate it. Go with God.